Now, China, the dominant global supplier of rare earth elements, has escalated its economic influence by imposing new export restrictions on critical materials.
In a sudden and dramatic escalation of global economic tensions, China has delivered a seismic shock to the international trade system by announcing a sweeping ban on exports of rare earth metals to the United States. This decisive move comes in immediate response to newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement of broad and aggressive tariffs targeting America's key trade partners. The world now stands at the precipice of a high-stakes geopolitical confrontation as Beijing's restriction targets the very heart of the U.S. automotive and technology sectors, potentially paralyzing them by severing access to critical raw materials. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Rare earth elements, though not widely known to the general public, are essential components in the manufacturing of electric vehicles, EVs, wind turbines, smartphones, advanced military hardware, and numerous high-tech applications. The U.S. car industry, particularly the burgeoning EV sector, relies heavily on a steady supply of these materials, with China controlling nearly 60 to 70% of the global production and refining capacity. By weaponizing its dominance over this strategic resource, China has struck at the Achilles heel of American industry, its dependency on imported critical materials. The ramifications of China's decision are immediate and profound. With the snap of a policy change, factories across the United States have been thrown into disarray. Major automakers that had invested billions into the development and production of electric vehicles now find themselves unable to access the neodymium, dysprosium, and praseodymium needed for EV motors. Assembly lines are slowing, and supply chains are grinding to a halt as procurement officers scramble to find alternative sources in a market where few viable substitutes exist. The United States had long known its vulnerability in this arena, but efforts to diversify rare earth supply chains have lagged behind due to cost, environmental hurdles, and logistical limitations. Now, those shortfalls are being felt in full force. China's move is not simply economic. It is a strategic demonstration of global power. By leveraging its dominance in rare earths, Beijing is sending a powerful message that it will not tolerate punitive measures from Washington without serious repercussions. This act of economic coercion reveals the fragility of global interdependence, exposing how critical national industries can be held hostage by supply chain imbalances. While Washington had sought to flex its economic muscle through tariffs, Beijing's response underscores that in the modern global economy, leverage comes not only from financial might, but from control over raw materials essential to the industries of the future. The political optics of this confrontation are explosive. Donald Trump's return to the presidency was marked by a renewed vow to put America first through a series of tariff hikes on countries with which the U.S. runs trade deficits. The announcement came with particular vitriol directed at China, long portrayed by Trump as an unfair trader and economic adversary. By striking back through rare earths, China has chosen a countermeasure that is both highly symbolic and materially devastating. It lays bare the limits of protectionist policies when a country is reliant on its rivals for key resources. Industry leaders in the United States are sounding alarms. Executives from Detroit to Silicon Valley are warning of production delays, job losses, and investment slowdowns. The timing could not be worse for American car makers, many of whom were just beginning to rebound from supply chain shocks of recent years. The EV revolution, heralded as the future of transportation and a pillar of U.S. industrial resurgence, faces a major roadblock. Without access to Chinese rare earths, the vision of American EV leadership may stall indefinitely. This crisis also exposes the U.S. government's decades-long neglect of domestic mining and refining capacity for rare earth elements. Though deposits exist within U.S. borders, particularly in states like California and Texas, environmental regulations, cost inefficiencies, and a lack of investment have kept domestic production marginal. Projects to develop alternative supply chains with allies like Australia and Canada have been discussed for years, but such partnerships require time, something the U.S. car industry does not currently have. The Chinese ban thus reveals the strategic risk of delayed industrial policy and the cost of outsourcing key sectors to geopolitical competitors. Globally, markets are reacting with volatility. The announcement has triggered sharp spikes in the prices of rare earth elements, while shares of U.S. automakers and tech companies have slumped. investors are grappling with the reality that a tit-for-tat trade war has morphed into a broader economic standoff, with potential consequences that stretch far beyond the two main players. Supply chains are global, and disruptions in one node ripple outward, affecting suppliers, manufacturers, and consumers across continents. Europe, Japan, and South Korea are also watching anxiously. These economies are heavily reliant on both Chinese rare earths and US technology. Any extended standoff could undermine global efforts to transition to green energy and electric mobility, both of which depend on stable access to these critical materials. Furthermore, there are rising fears that other countries could be caught in the crossfire of economic nationalism. As China consolidates its grip over strategic minerals, it may begin to demand loyalty or concessions in exchange for continued access, ushering in a new era of resource-based diplomacy. Strategically, this moment marks a turning point in the global order. The long-standing assumption that economic interdependence would deter great power confrontation is being tested. China's rare earth ban is a clear example of how economic tools are now central to geopolitical competition. Rather than missiles or armies, nations are increasingly using supply chains and trade routes as levers of influence. For the United States, this demands a profound re-evaluation of its industrial base, national security strategy, and international alliances. From a domestic standpoint, Trump's administration now faces the challenge of managing the fallout. The tariffs were intended to rejuvenate American manufacturing and bring jobs back to U.S. soil. However, the immediate result appears to be the opposite. Production disruptions, cost hikes, and potential layoffs. Workers in auto plants, already whipsawed by years of globalization and automation, now face another round of uncertainty. Labor unions, industry groups, and even Republican-leaning business leaders are demanding swift government intervention. The Biden administration had previously initiated efforts to secure critical mineral supply chains, including funding domestic mining projects and forging international alliances. Trump's abrupt tariff policy shift, however, has introduced a new layer of unpredictability, making long-term strategic planning more difficult. The U.S. must now decide whether to double down on confrontation, risking further escalation, or seek a diplomatic off-ramp to restore trade flows. The coming weeks will test the mettle of U.S. leadership and the coherence of its economic strategy. Meanwhile, China appears to be playing a long game. By using rare earths as a pressure point, it not only retaliates against U.S. tariffs, but also signals its readiness to assert economic sovereignty. Beijing's state-controlled media has framed the move as a necessary defense of national interests, and there is little sign of internal dissent. If anything, the policy strengthens domestic political support by portraying China as standing firm against foreign aggression. For President Xi Jinping, the confrontation may even bolster his narrative of a rising China resisting Western containment. The Chinese ban also reinforces Beijing's goal of shifting its economy up the value chain. Rather than simply exporting raw materials, China increasingly seeks to dominate downstream industries like electric vehicles, batteries, and advanced electronics. By denying rare earths to the US, China effectively weakens its competitors while nurturing its own champions. The strategy is ruthlessly effective and reflects a broader vision of industrial supremacy that extends well into the future. For the US, the path forward is fraught with complexity. Short-term solutions like stockpiling or sourcing from third countries are unlikely to fill the immediate gap. The reality is that rebuilding a self-sufficient supply chain will take years of investment and policy coherence. Moreover, doing so in an environment of heightened trade tensions could prove costly, both economically and diplomatically. Allies may be reluctant to take sides, wary of provoking Chinese retaliation or losing access to crucial technologies from the United States. At the same time, the crisis has renewed bipartisan interest in reshoring critical industries. Lawmakers from both parties are calling for urgent legislation to boost domestic mining, streamline permitting processes, and fund research into alternative materials. For a deeply polarized Washington, this may prove to be one of the few areas of consensus. The question remains whether political will can translate into sustained action. As supply shortages begin to bite, consumers are likely to feel the pinch. Prices for electric vehicles may rise, and availability may dwindle. The push for green energy, long championed as both environmentally necessary and economically advantageous, risks losing momentum. American tech firms may also face delays in producing cutting-edge products, diminishing their competitiveness in global markets. This is not just an industrial issue. It is one that touches nearly every facet of modern life. The broader implication of China's ban is the stark realization that globalization, once seen as an irreversible tide, is entering a new and more turbulent phase. The free flow of goods and materials, long taken for granted, is now subject to strategic calculus and political brinkmanship. Nations must confront the vulnerabilities of complex interdependence and make hard choices about security, sovereignty, and sustainability. As global dynamics shift, so too must the strategies of major powers. For the United States, the rare earth crisis could become a catalyst for long overdue structural changes. But that transformation will not come easily or quickly. In the meantime, the country must navigate the fallout of a bold Chinese power play that has shaken the foundations of its industrial economy and exposed the limits of unilateral economic aggression. With rare earth exports frozen and American tariffs in full effect, the world watches with bated breath as two superpowers square off in an economic chess match with high stakes and no guaranteed winner. The outcome will shape not just the future of US-China relations, but the very architecture of the global economic order. While the initial shockwaves of China's rare earth export ban reverberate through global markets and industries, the deeper layers of this geopolitical maneuver begin to reveal a far more intricate tapestry of long-term implications. Beyond the immediate disruption to supply chains, this act has redefined the balance of economic power and set in motion a transformation of strategic priorities for nations across the globe. The confrontation is not merely about trade or industrial policy. It is a crystallization of competing worldviews, an authoritarian, state-capitalist model leveraging its centralized control over resources versus a market-driven, decentralized liberal democracy suddenly realizing the fragility of its supply network. The US car industry, especially its high-tech EV and hybrid sectors, stands not only at risk of operational shutdowns, but also reputational damage. Investors and consumers alike are growing wary of a production ecosystem that is so susceptible to external shocks. For decades, the American economy had emphasized efficiency, outsourcing, just-in-time manufacturing, and global sourcing strategies. But efficiency has come at the cost of resilience. China's calculated embargo underscores how this system, once heralded as the pinnacle of capitalist ingenuity, can buckle when geopolitical friction enters the equation. As the crisis deepens, attention is turning to the underbelly of US infrastructure and its heavy reliance on imported technologies that depend on rare earths. From MRI machines in hospitals to guidance systems in defense apparatuses, the absence of these critical minerals jeopardizes not only economic productivity, but also national security. Behind the scenes, Pentagon officials are increasingly alarmed. Defense contractors depend on rare earths for manufacturing jet engines, radar systems, and precision-guided munitions. With China cutting off supply, the U.S. military-industrial complex faces a strategic blind spot, one that could undermine its technological edge in future conflicts. Think tanks and analysts are now examining the broader pattern of Chinese resource nationalism. This isn't an isolated incident. Beijing has, over the past decade, subtly amassed influence over other strategic materials as well. Cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, lithium from South America, and increasingly rare semiconductor materials from the global south. By building extensive trade and infrastructure agreements through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has methodically positioned itself as the gatekeeper to many of the materials that drive the 21st century economy. The rare earths embargo is just one prong in a multidimensional strategy to shift the balance of global influence. While the US scrambles to formulate an emergency response, other global players are reassessing their dependencies. Japan, having suffered a similar rare earth shock in 2010 after a maritime spat with China, had diversified its sourcing by investing in rare earth ventures in Vietnam and India. European nations, particularly Germany, are now accelerating efforts to develop domestic refining capabilities and circular economy models that rely on recycling rare earths from discarded electronics. Yet these are not short-term fixes. Establishing full-spectrum rare earth independence takes not only financial investment, but also time, technological know-how, and political will, all of which are in short supply during a crisis. What adds complexity to this geopolitical rupture is the growing role of climate policy in economic competition. The race to dominate green technologies, electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, is central to national agendas. Rare earths are at the core of this transition. By controlling access, China is not just undermining U.S. industry, it is also attempting to define who will lead the global green revolution. In essence, this is not just about rare earths. It's about who will dictate the rules of the emerging post-carbon world economy. For China, this embargo also serves an internal purpose. By externalizing pressure, the government galvanizes nationalistic sentiment and consolidates internal political power. The narrative of resisting Western economic aggression is playing well domestically, reinforcing the state's legitimacy at a time when it faces slowing economic growth, demographic challenges, and rising global scrutiny. In this context, the rare earth embargo is as much about managing domestic perception as it is about sending a message to Washington. Meanwhile, smaller countries caught in the crosshairs of this standoff are attempting to recalibrate. Australia, one of the few nations with significant rare earth reserves, is witnessing a surge of interest from Western governments and investors. But while its mining sector can help fill some of the gaps, refining capacity remains limited, and expanding it requires major infrastructure and environmental clearances. Similarly, countries like Canada, Brazil, and Greenland are exploring their untapped rare earth potential, hoping to attract investment from nations eager to diversify their supply chains. The corporate world is also responding with urgency. Tech companies are accelerating research into alternatives to rare earths, including synthetic materials and design changes that reduce reliance on these elements. Engineers are revisiting product blueprints, looking for ways to retool manufacturing processes to adapt to new material constraints. Some are exploring urban mining, the extraction of rare earths from old electronics, though scalability remains a challenge. However, innovation alone won't bridge the current supply chasm. The reality is that a rare earth refinery cannot be built overnight. It demands not only capital and engineering, but also political stability, community consent, and a long-term vision. This crisis could spark a new kind of industrial policy in the United States, one that mirrors the urgency and coherence seen during World War II or the space race. Whether the current political climate allows for such unified mobilization remains uncertain. Educational institutions, too, are awakening to the new strategic landscape. Universities and research labs are receiving increased funding to study rare earth geology, refining techniques, and recycling methods. New academic programs are being launched to train a generation of engineers and geologists capable of navigating this resource-centric world. The emerging recognition is that economic resilience will hinge not just on trade policies, but on cultivating the knowledge systems that enable technological self-sufficiency. Meanwhile, Wall Street is recalibrating its forecasts. Analysts who once based their evaluations on market fundamentals are now factoring in geopolitical risks as a primary variable. ESG investing, once focused largely on environmental and social outcomes, is being expanded to include strategic vulnerability to global supply shocks. Shareholders are demanding that companies show clearer contingency plans for sourcing critical materials, much as they would for cybersecurity threats or climate-related disruptions. There's also a growing awareness that rare earths, and the broader critical minerals they represent, could become the oil of the 21st century. Just as energy politics defined global relations for the last century, mineral politics may define this one. Control over these resources could shape alliances, trigger conflicts, and reconfigure trade routes. Maritime choke points, already crucial for oil and gas shipping, may become just as vital for transporting rare earth concentrates and refined products. In Washington, the ban has catalyzed a rare moment of bipartisan urgency. Emergency sessions in Congress are debating the invocation of the Defense Production Act to boost domestic rare earth output. Tax incentives for rare earth mining, streamlined regulatory approvals, and federal contracts for private suppliers are all under discussion. There's also talk of establishing a strategic mineral reserve, akin to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, to buffer against future supply shocks. Amid all this, a philosophical debate is emerging about the future of globalization. The assumption that open markets naturally lead to peace and prosperity is under siege. The rare earth embargo underscores that economic interdependence can be used not just as a shield, but as a sword. Policymakers are reconsidering which sectors should be treated as strategic and which supply chains must be brought home, even at higher costs. National security, once the domain of military planners, is now being redefined to include semiconductor fabs, lithium mines, and rare earth smelters. China's bold power move has also triggered introspection among America's allies. NATO members are increasingly viewing supply chain security as a shared concern. Discussions are underway about forming a critical materials alliance among like-minded democracies to pool resources, coordinate investments, and establish shared refining and processing infrastructure. Such an alliance could serve as both an economic bloc and a geopolitical counterweight to Chinese resource hegemony. For U.S. consumers, the effects will soon be tangible. As inventory shortages spread through car dealerships, prices will rise, not just for electric vehicles, but also for hybrids, traditional autos with tech-intensive features, and even aftermarket components. Smartphones, gaming consoles, and other consumer electronics may see similar disruptions. Over time, this could shift consumer behavior, reducing demand or redirecting it toward less tech-heavy alternatives. It could also fuel discontent if the economic pain is perceived as the result of governmental overreach or foreign provocation. Across the Pacific, China's maneuver may invite both awe and apprehension from other authoritarian regimes. It showcases a form of leverage that is less overtly aggressive than military action, but no less effective. If this strategy proves successful, it could embolden other nations to weaponize their own strategic assets, whether water, agricultural land, or data infrastructure. The precedent being set is dangerous. Economic coercion is increasingly viewed as a legitimate tool of statecraft. As tensions harden, the risk of miscalculation looms large. A prolonged standoff over rare earths could spill into broader areas: currency markets, intellectual property disputes, maritime confrontations, even cyberspace. The feedback loop between economic warfare and military escalation is fraught with unpredictability. Deterrence in this context is not measured in troops or missiles, but in factories, refineries, and the resilience of supply networks. The rare earth embargo marks a turning point not only in US-China relations, but in the evolution of global capitalism itself. It has pierced the illusion of invulnerability surrounding advanced economies and revealed how deeply they remain entangled in resource dependencies. The challenge ahead is not just to resolve this specific standoff, but to fundamentally rethink the architecture of modern industrial civilization, how it sources its materials, distributes its production, and manages its vulnerabilities. What began as a reaction to a tariff policy has quickly spiraled into a grand chessboard of strategy, ideology, and survival. In a world that had grown comfortable with frictionless trade and borderless production, this moment is a rude awakening. The question now is not whether the US and its allies will respond, but how, and whether their response will be fast, bold, and unified enough to shift the tide. In the fog of this unfolding confrontation, one thing is clear: the era of naive globalization is over. A new phase has begun. An age of economic realism, strategic autonomy, and high-stakes resource diplomacy. The global economy will never operate the same way again. And for those caught unprepared, the price of delay will be counted not just in dollars, but in power, influence, and the fate of industries that define the future. As the rare earth crisis enters its next phase, the intricate web of consequences stretches even further, touching domains previously considered peripheral to the commodities market. The cascading effect is not limited to manufacturers or policymakers. It is redefining academic priorities, altering diplomatic calculations, and triggering a reorientation of industrial and technological strategy that will span generations. This conflict, instigated by a single but sweeping move from China, is quickly evolving into a global systems test, a trial of resilience, foresight, and geopolitical adaptability. Universities across the world are responding by rapidly recalibrating their curricula. Fields like geology, material science, and supply chain engineering are seeing surging interest. Academic departments are forming new research clusters around critical minerals, with a focus not only on extraction, but on life cycle management. These changes mark the beginning of what some educators are calling a new industrial enlightenment, where resource literacy becomes as essential as digital fluency. Scholars are studying ancient mining practices alongside cutting-edge extraction methods, realizing that technological sovereignty in the coming era may depend as much on interdisciplinary thinking as it does on scientific advancement. This reshaping of education is paralleled by a transformation in finance. Venture capital and institutional investors are shifting their focus toward resource-centric startups, companies exploring rare earth substitutes, pioneering advanced metallurgy, and developing AI-driven exploration techniques. These technologies, still in their infancy, are receiving unprecedented funding rounds, driven by the understanding that whoever cracks the code of rare earth independence could dominate future markets. Traditional ESG investing is also undergoing a metamorphosis. Environmental concerns, while still vital, are being weighed more carefully against the strategic need to ensure supply security. Ethical mining in allied nations is being rebranded not just as green investment but as national defense. In the halls of international diplomacy, this new mineral-centric power struggle is remapping alliances. Historically, trade-agnostic diplomatic forums are being repurposed to serve economic coordination. Nations like India, which straddle strategic neutrality, are being courted heavily by both the US and China as potential swing states in this minerals-based Cold War. India's vast reserves of critical minerals and its growing technological sector give it leverage it has never held before. As it evaluates proposals for joint ventures and rare earth refining projects, New Delhi finds itself in a uniquely empowered position. Simultaneously, African nations are rising in prominence. Long seen by the West primarily through the lens of development aid or extractive investment, countries like Namibia, Malawi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are now courted as vital partners. They possess not only rare earth deposits, but also the geographical flexibility to diversify global supply lines. This shift offers Africa a renewed opportunity to rewrite its historical role in global supply chains, not just as a source of raw materials, but as a stakeholder in refining, processing, and even end product manufacturing. However, this opportunity is a double-edged sword. Without stringent governance and equitable contracts, the continent risks a new era of resource exploitation, simply under different branding. Even cultural and political discourse is being reshaped. Popular narratives are forming around the idea of resource patriotism, where consumers and voters are encouraged to support domestic products not just out of economic interest, but as a stand against foreign dependency. Documentaries, books, and media exposés are emerging to trace the path from a smartphone chip back to a rare earth mine in China, weaving a sense of urgency into public consciousness. The cultural zeitgeist is tilting toward a new form of techno-nationalism, one that blends the frontier spirit of Silicon Valley with the sober imperatives of strategic autonomy. Artificial intelligence, often viewed through the lens of data and software, is now playing a pivotal role in the rare earth race. AI-driven models are being used to identify geological formations likely to contain rare earths with greater accuracy than traditional methods. Machine learning is being deployed in real time to optimize extraction processes, predict equipment maintenance, and minimize waste. This fusion of digital and physical infrastructure represents the cutting edge of what's being termed resource tech, an emerging sector where geoscience meets automation and analytics to create agile, efficient supply networks. Satellite technology is also being repurposed. High-resolution imaging satellites, once primarily used for environmental monitoring or military surveillance, are now scanning for rare earth mining activity, deforestation linked to illegal extraction, and the development of refining infrastructure in hostile territories. The convergence of space tech and supply chain security is no longer theoretical. It is rapidly becoming operationalized, especially by US and European agencies anxious to regain situational awareness in a rapidly shifting global mineral map. Amid all this technological innovation, one domain is undergoing a more subtle but equally significant shift: law. Trade lawyers and international arbitration experts are preparing for a wave of litigation and treaty renegotiation. The World Trade Organization, already under strain, finds itself thrust back into relevance, yet simultaneously questioned for its ability to adjudicate resource nationalism. China's embargo may inspire copycat moves in other sectors, pushing international legal norms into a gray area where economic sovereignty and collective obligations collide. The legal frameworks that govern 20th century globalization are proving ill-equipped for the resource politics of the 21st. Climate policy, too, is being forced into uncomfortable recalibration. The vision of a decarbonized world, powered by clean energy and electrified transport, was built on assumptions of open markets and unfettered access to critical minerals. With those assumptions collapsing, environmentalists and policymakers are forced to confront difficult trade-offs. Should nations accept higher emissions from domestic rare earth mining to secure green technology independence? Can circular economy initiatives scale fast enough to fill the gap? Is it environmentally justifiable to source materials from countries with poor ecological standards if the alternative is geopolitical subordination? If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on China's rare earth ban affecting the US car industry? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.